Okay, so we're going to talk about just looking at the major points in the development of Jerusalem, the temple, and the different types of rulers and leaders that were involved in the whole area. This area, this region of Judea, which they call Palestine or Israel today, modern day Israel is basically encompasses the former kingdom of Judah and Israel, and it has been really occupied by many ruling entities over time. There have been five major world powers prior to the Roman Empire. And then there are some minor ones that existed beforehand, before they actually took control of Canaan. Um, so when they came out of Egypt, right, they went into the land of Canaan. We know that that was part of the new kingdom of Egypt. And then they established the kingdom of Israel, which split into Israel and Judah. And then we have this is just a reference breakdown of the different rulers and kingdoms that were the dynasties that sort of ruled over the land of Israel. Okay. So we're going to talk about, this is all to deal with the topic of what's called third wave Zionism. Okay. And there's this notion that there should be, that in the last days, a lot of Christians are teaching that they're expecting a new temple to be built. And that as Christians, we support Israel because we need to support the creation of that third temple because it will hasten the coming of our Lord. That's not what I read in the Bible, and that's not what I mean. There are some things that could be interpreted that way, but there's a lot of evidence in the Bible that speaks contrary to that. So that's something that we really don't have to be concerned with. And this is sort of the point of what this is all about, of why we don't really need to concern ourselves with this Zionist movement right now. And what it just kind of help us find out that we need to be in a disposition of not really worrying about Israel. The Lord's going to handle Israel. We need to be worrying about the kingdom of God that's coming, New Jerusalem, that will be coming down from heaven after the rapture of the church. So, but this is to give just a little bit of the sense to the madness that goes on and the weird teachings that go on in some churches. Some churches won't even touch the topic. I see something coming in the chat here. Oh, welcome. Okay, someone joined. Hello. Let's see here. I don't know how to get rid of the chat again. I think if I just close it, I'll do that. Okay, there we go.
Hey, Kristen joined.
Hey, Kristen. Hey.
Also, we can't see your overlay, so when the chat pops up, it's not in the way for us. We're only seeing what's on your screen.
Okay. Good to know. So this one, we're not going to be doing a lot of huge Bible stuff. We're going to look really at history, and I'm going to lace in some scriptures for you. And there's more work I have to do on this presentation to make it something I can circulate, because there's a lot more scriptures that support each of these different slides. Because really, everything that happens, it has a place in the Bible where it was prophesied to happen. For example, when Cyrus the Great, the Assyrian, takes over the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus the Great comes in and takes over Jerusalem, the reason that he doesn't kill them all and destroy everything is because Isaiah prophesied 200 years prior to his entry into the kingdom and spoke his name. It would be like George Watt. I heard a guy today. I was watching an analogy online with another Bible theologian. He was saying it was as if George Washington becoming president in 1789 would be told the name of the president or be told about Gorbachev in coming in 1988, that he would be the one to break down the Berlin Wall and to end the Cold War 200 years later. And not just that there would be somebody coming, but specifically his name and where he was from. So it would be like literally like, I don't know who would be an advisor to George Washington at that time. Someone who's a history buff. Give me a name here. who would be or who was
John
Wesley
Adams.
there? Hmm?
Oh, I
But it
just
would be
pulled the
like a
name out of that.
pastor, right? Like a pastor or a preacher in George Washington's time, giving him counsel and saying, Russia's monarchy is going to fall. It's going to become an evil empire. And in 1988, 200 years from now, a man named Gorbachev will come out of Russia. He'll be elected by the people, and he'll tear down the wall that separates the continent of Europe. That's the extent of the Bible prophecy that Isaiah gave. So when Cyrus came in, they didn't actually stand to fight him. They came with the scroll of Isaiah and showed it to him and showed it to Cyrus and said, "Look, we knew you were coming." And he was blown away. And so he took them into captivity and didn't slaughter them because he saw his own name in their scriptures. That's how amazing this Bible is. So we're going to go through a little bit of this now. Let's see. So I've given you two when I can circulate this for you. I've given you a list of the kings of Israel and Judah over time, starting from Saul to David, Solomon, and then the kings of Judah and how they split up over time. So from 4000 to 3000 BC, the region was first kind of settled by nomadic shepherds. And then around 2000 to 1800 BC, Abram, who became Abraham, left Ur of the Chaldees for Canaan. So Abraham basically was a descendant of Shem, and the Shemites went south and lived in this. In fact, if you heard the word anti-Semite, the word Semite or Semitic comes from the name Shem, which is the son of Noah. So the generations of Shem lived in this are those that live in this area that are sort of Arabic or Semitic peoples, right? So they are Shemite or Semite people, descendants of Noah. Remember, not too far north were the mountains of Ararat in Turkey, where the ark came to rest. Shem's people moved south, Japheth's moved north, and Ham's moved into Africa, and also points further east. But the Shemites, they stayed in this general central region here. So they're all sort of some of the same ancestry. But God speaks to Abram and says, "You need to leave the land of your fathers and go to a land where I will tell you." And he sends him to Canaan, right? And in Canaan, there's a place called Salem. There's a city called Salem. There's a king of Salem. His name is Melchizedek. In conquering some of the land, Abraham meets this Melchizedek and gives him a tithe because this man is a priest of the Most High God. And it's the only priest that we know that's recorded. There's no temple going on. There's no temple worship. There's no central sort of idea of like the Jews at this point in time. And even before the books of Moses was written, we have the book of Job. So that's the first book of the Bible that was ever written was the book of Job. It wasn't Genesis. Okay. And then after that, the Jews they go into Egypt, right? They're taken into captivity. There's 400 years of bondage. I didn't include that because it has to do with Egypt. 400 years of bondage. Then they're released, right? We all know the story of the Exodus. And after the Exodus, Moses is attributed to being the writer of the first 5 books of our Old Testament Bible, which is called in Greek the Pentateuch, or in um, Hebrew the Torah, which is Genesis, Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So those 5 books are called the Torah. So you ever hear Jewish people speaking of the Torah? That is their primary doctrine, their primary history, and their foundational document of the Bible. So in the first sections, there are sections in the Bible. You've got books of poetry, books of the Torah, which is books of the law and of the narrative of the history of the Jewish people. You have the major prophets, you have the minor prophets, and I believe there's one other category. What you guys could help me out there, but I think it's poetry, and then there's the Psalms too. Psalms.
Mackenzie asked a question. She asked,
Yeah.
how do we know that Job is the first written book of the Bible?
That goes into the textual analysis. I'm relying on the textual, the general consensus from the sort of those that have um, their experience and background and research in textual analysis, and that's the general consensus around the most scholars. So I can go into some of that, or we can research down those holes. But basically, my research is basically this is meant to give you an aggregation of facts so that you can go down these rabbit holes like that and go find these little paths that are interesting to you like this. How do we know, right? The answers are there. I'm just not presenting them here. But yeah, go just do those searches. Look at the source books. When was Job written? Who was these written? What is the authorship of this book? Is it verifiable? Is it hard to verify? Do we have manuscripts? All those questions are fair questions. And there's a whole discipline in Christianity called textual criticism, where that is completely devoted to these questions and answers. And that's filled with atheists, agnostics, and believers. So the interesting thing is the community of textual critics tend to agree, and that's which is interesting on these things because it's Jews, it's Christians, it's agnostics, and it's atheists, or atheists. And so a lot of them will all have the same opinions on the textual. For example, let's take the topic of uh, the textual preservation over time of the Greek New Testament. There are something like 20 to 30,000 variations in between the texts of all of the known manuscripts that we have, of the thousands of manuscripts that we have, right? And of those manuscripts, there's maybe 12 places that have pivotal meaning where it alters the text depending on how you render it. The other ones are inconsequential. And it's things like one scribe will write out the word for God, theta, theta, eta, omicron, upsilon. And the other one will just put theta, upsilon. And it still means theo in both cases, but one's just putting a shorthand. Well, some of the traditions that Jews had was not to fully write the name of God. So you'll see Jesus, God, or Lord, sometimes abbreviated, or you'll see the Spirit. Some will write pneumos or pneumatos, and some will put pneumos, and some will say nos, but it's all the same word. So those are some of the variations that exist, but it doesn't. But when you know and you understand how that scribe is writing, it doesn't impute anything meaningful to the text. So we can actually look through early fragments and things like that to find out the historicity and the quality of the translation of the text by going to older sources, things like that. We can do a whole Bible study on that. If you're interested, let me know. I can do something on textual analysis and how to what are good principles to understand that. But it's a good question. But yeah, so you'll notice there are some ranges, right? And so there's some disputes necessarily. There's even disputes about when Jesus was born and when Herod the Great was born and died and reigned. So I'm giving you some ranges in these cases, and you can see the cases that are made by various historians and scholars as to why they favor one early or later date. But as we saw in the last Bible study, it's sort of important as to learning when the book of Revelation was written, for example, because if it's written before the year 70, the Babylon could be referring to Jerusalem being destroyed. But if it's written after AD 70, conventionally it's given as 95 or 96, that Jerusalem has already been destroyed. It's speaking of a different city, in this case, Rome. So knowing these dates and these ranges and how it has an impact on how you interpret things like prophecy, it's very important. So yeah, these ranges I give are citations from scholars. It's Wikipedia stuff. It could be dubious, but I'm giving you ranges so that you can understand like the sequence more or less of events rather than it's this specific date. It's more like let's learn the order of events, and then we can go in your own study and pick through these things and go down these rabbit trails. But does that answer the question? Did it help?
Yeah, and thank you for going into the actual discipline as
Yeah.
well.
Mhm. So in 1030, 1010, Jordan wrote a little comic book that is based on this story about how the Jews wanted to appoint for them. They were tired of being sort of a theocracy ruled by the priests and the judges, and they wanted to have a king installed over them. And God didn't want them to have a king. And he said, basically, the king is going to exact from you more than you're willing to really give. And be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. So they got King Saul. And then after that, David, who was considered a man after God's own heart. This is 1000 BC. And his son Solomon reigns over Israel and Judah. The kingdom was divided in David's day into the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. But for the range of the year 1000, when David started his temple, and 600 BC, the King Solomon's temple was built on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah was the mountain where Abram offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Interestingly enough, when that was a wilderness at that time. But in 772, before it was completed, the Assyrians captured Israel. In 739, 637, so now they're under Syrian control. Hezekiah became the 13th king over Israel. And in 733, actually, sorry, even though he was king, they were exiled. And so some of them were sent back to Assyria as sort of slaves, and they were basically deported from the region. This is a common thing that you're going to see happening over time, is their continuous deportation from their own land. And then in 605, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II besieges Jerusalem, takes it from Syria. Now this is during the time of this enters the time of Darius and Daniel in the lion's den, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, all this stuff, right? And he plundered the temple in 598 and 597. And then after the siege, at the end of his siege, it took about 10 years to fully control it. Nebuchadnezzar II conquers Jerusalem and destroys the temple. And then those Jews that were still in Israel then were exiled to Babylon, and they were deported. Let's pull up 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23. We can read a little bit about that if someone wants to grab that and read it. I understand this is a little jumpy.
What was the chapter and verse?
2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23. This is written by the prophet Ezra. You have it?
I've got it, I think.
Okay.
I just don't want to cause an echo.
You said it was Second Chronicles 36, 22, and 23.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, it says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth has the Lord God of heaven given me, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord God be with him, and let him go up.
Okay, so in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great conquers the Median Empire and forms the first Medo-Persian Empire. Now you see to his west here is the Babylonian Empire, right? So he's the one who comes and conquers here. Whoops. Okay. So in 539, in 538 BC, Cyrus the Great of Medo-Persia invites the Jews of Babylon, who are in exile in Babylon, to return to Judah to rebuild their temple, because he was persuaded by the prophet. So let's read these three scriptures here. Someone want to get Ezra 1 through 4. Somebody else get Ezra 4, 6 to 24. And then Ezra 6, 1 to 12.
I can do Ezra 1, 1 through 4.
Okay.
It says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of
Can you
Persia.
speak up a little bit?
Yeah.
So Jeremiah has given a prophecy, as was talking about this.
Did you say speak up or speed up?
Speak up. Volume.
Oh,
Yeah, volume, please.
oh.
Or come a little closer to your,
Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whoever remains in any place where he sojourns, let the man of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of God that's in Jerusalem.
Okay, so people always ask, really unlearned people will ask this question: do you take the Bible literally? Right? That's got to be the stupidest question ever, right? Because of course you take historical narrative literally, because it's not figurative language, right? The implication with that question is that you're reading some sort of book of mysterious poetry that you have to interpret, and a little interpretation will get you in error because it's meant to be figurative, right? What they don't understand is there's 66 books in the Bible, all written with different functions and purposes. And in this case, Ezra is not speaking prophetically. He's giving us a historical record of what happened when Cyrus came to power. So there's no interpretation needed. We don't read this and interpret it. We read it to understand. We read it like a historical text. And the things that it reveals to us are things that archaeology, paleontology, historical records should corroborate, and they do. And so that's one of the things I want to caution people when you guys get, do you take the Bible literally? It's literally the dumbest question, because anyone who's ever read the Bible understands that the Bible isn't one giant book of mystery poetry, right? Or complete like Greek allegorical symbolism with fantastical creatures that are supposed to be real.
It's not a book of spells.
Right, right. So some things are actually written as narrative and as historical record. That's what this is. That's what we're reading here. Even though Ezra is a prophet, he's not giving a prophecy here. He's recording what's happening to his people, because those people in the back days were scribes They were one of some of the few people who could actually write. And so it makes sense that people who could write would be writing records of the things that were happening to people as a whole. And these are major events. So read this like a journalist, or an eyewitness historian. Okay, so someone else grabs Ezra 4:6 through 24. We might not read the whole thing, but
I have 6 through 24.
go for it. I might stop you, but
Okay. And of course, look at all these beautiful, lovely names. So I'll try. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Artaxerxes, also Bishlam,
it's Artaxerxes.
Artaxerxes.
Yep.
In the reign of Artaxerxes, also Bishlam, Mithridates, Tabal, and the rest of their companions wrote to Artaxerxes, good, king of Persia, and the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. Raham, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes in this fashion. From Raham,
let me pause you for a second here.
Okay.
Why is he using all these names? Because he's writing like a historian.
Record.
He is proving the validity of what happened by offering these names, and history bears record of there are actually stelae, which are like columns with ancient Aramaic script that are carved into the columns that have to deal with this exact thing written during the time of Artaxerxes, and his name is on there, and it talks about all of this outside of the Bible. Okay, keep going.
Okay. From Raham the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of their companions, representatives of the Danites and the Apharsathites, the Tarbilites, the people of Persia, and Iraq and Babylon and Shushan, and the Davites, the Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Osnappar took captive and settled in the cities of Samaria and the remainder beyond the river, and so forth. This is a copy of the letter that they sent him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem, and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known to the king that this city is built and the walls completed. They will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished.
Okay, pause right there. In the book of Daniel, which we may get to tonight, it talks about a decree to go forth to rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall. And it gives Daniel 70 weeks until the Messiah comes. And it talks about the start of the time clock for when Messiah comes, the 70 weeks or whatever, starts with that decree that they're referring to in the book of Ezra. So right now, this decree, Daniel, who will be writing in his book under the Babylonian reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had written that there will be coming this new power, and that from the destruction of Israel, from the command to restore and rebuild it, there'll be 70 weeks, and in that 69th week or 68th week, Messiah will come. So look at the time frame we're in. We're about 600 years before Messiah comes. Right? Interesting, right? Keep going.
Also, I apologize. I read some of that wrong because it didn't make sense to me, but now it makes sense. On verse 14. Now, because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we've sent and informed the king. That search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if the city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. The king sent an answer to Raham the commander, to Shimshai the scribe, to the rest of their companions who dwell in Samaria, and to the remainder beyond the river, peace and so forth. The letter which he
talking
sent,
about the Jordan River.
okay. The letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me, and I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that this city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and custom were paid to them.
Okay, so what he's doing is he's quoting a letter written by non-Jews explaining the condition of the history of what we just read in Ezra 1, right? And what we just learned about Cyrus and about the Medes and about the Canaanites and all this other stuff, and the kings of the mighty kings, David and Solomon. Here, these Medo-Persians are writing to that have basically are trying to rebuild the foundational walls of the city to establish a stronghold for Cyrus the Great, is saying that this has been a place of rebellion and trouble in the past for other conquerors, right? So that's what he's saying. And then he's saying that this place has had that they've had their own kings that have been powerful in their own right. So the reason he's quoting this is that it corroborates. So he's quoting an extra biblical resource to corroborate what we already know. So it's a historical proof text.
Dang.
Mhm.
Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. So this is Cyrus writing this?
I'm not sure who's writing it. It was all those men that were writing to Artaxerxes, all the people from Dan and all these different tribes.
But the king,
that were part of they're like people that they're like tribes that were loyal to Artaxerxes that were writing to him that had been commissioned to do the work.
This is Artaxerxes' reply.
Okay.
Yeah.
Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Raham, Shimshai the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Thus the work of the house of God which is at Jerusalem ceased, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius the king of Persia.
Yeah. So they were concerned about them returning all the people there to a stronghold they haven't yet taken power over. Because they didn't want to build the walls and build a fortress for them just to return the people just to fight them again. So they delayed the construction until they could be sure of themselves. Okay, let's skip ahead to Ezra 6, 1 through 12. But what this is doing is it's quoting documents that are not Bible documents, that are historical documents that have been found and history has recorded that these things are true. So it's one of the reasons why you can trust the Bible is because it's historically accurate. Okay, especially the book of Ezra. Someone else want to grab Ezra 6, 1 through 12?
I can read it. Is there any echo?
A little bit.
I'll
put
you
my
might have to mute yourself.
Yeah, I'll mute for him.
King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. A scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. Memorandum. In the 1st year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high.
Okay, hit pause for a second. So remember, there's no temple built, right? So we've had Cyrus and Artaxerxes, and now we're on to King Darius, right? And Darius finds this scroll written by Cyrus, which was the decree to build a temple that had not been yet built. So it's like he's basically going through the archives and seeing what's what, and he's like, "Oh crap, there's this unfinished business here," and he finds this edict that wasn't done. So say that again.
The whole thing.
Just the second part of it.
Memorandum.
Memorandum.
In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with 3 courses of large stones and one of timbers. The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple of Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. Now then, Tatanai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and you other officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God.
Now pause for a second. There are actually relief carvings of the Babylonian exile, and it shows the Babylonians carrying off the temple furniture, the menorah, the lampstand, all that stuff into Babylon. The Ark of the Covenant, all of it.
Wow.
And so they didn't destroy it. So they're returning it now. They're going to return that all back to the temple. Interesting that even though a foreign invader who cared nothing for their gods, they just took it as booty. They took it as bounty, as treasure. But they didn't do anything with it. They just used it as like ornamentation or put it in their treasury. But God preserved it because here it was dragged off to Babylon, and now it's going to be dragged back right back to where it was in a new and better temple.
Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
Josh, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't the fact that Darius did this because of the favor he had with Daniel?
Yes, that's going to be mentioned in Daniel, but also it has to do, and there might have been a conversation between him and Daniel about this, but we don't. I haven't quite woven that in yet. But yes, I haven't gotten into
Okay.
There's a lot of work to do in this study. It should be. This is a study which should be a book, right? I'm
Yeah.
trying not to make it a book so we can get through it as a study, but yes.
I just thought it was I just thought it was cool how those things were happening simultaneously, to like set the stage for this to happen.
Right, exactly. Because there's a whole angle with Daniel we haven't even gotten into. Because I'm trying to deal with it from the things that are lesser known about the whole situation. So we'll come back, and the whole Daniel 9 and 11 and 12 and all that is I haven't quite gotten to finish that part of this study yet, but that's exactly right. Now, so what's interesting is that today in Jerusalem we have the Al-Aqsa Mosque sitting on the Temple Mount on Mount Moriah, and that's where they say that there was never a Jewish temple there. And they say that that's where Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's the third holiest, most holy site in Islamic teaching. But when did Islam come about? About 500, 600 AD? Roughly 1,000 to 1,200 years after this decree of Darius to honor Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple. Rebuild the temple, not build the temple, rebuild the temple. So part of what makes the Temple Mount desolate to this day is the fact that you have a pagan temple erected in the place of Mount Moriah.
There's kind of a crazy bit at the end of this too.
Okay.
Um, it says, furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they are to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. Wow.
Yeah, on pains of death, this temple will be built, really.
In my translation, it says, "And his house shall be made a dunghill."
Mm. Which means literally they're going to turn it into the crap house of the community. Like that's what, because then people would drag their stuff off in a bucket
Some
and
dung
dump it
heap.
in a certain spot called a dunghill. And so what they're saying is that anyone who dishonors the thing, that we're going to level his house, and that house is going to be the dunghill. That means there's no honor in that family anymore. That's pretty serious stuff. And these were not believing kings. These were kings who were persuaded by the power of God, that were not followers of God. Okay, so in 536, let's go to Ezra 3, 8, and 12. This foundation is laid for the second temple. Matt, you want to read that one? Ezra 3, verses 8, and then skip to 12.
Sure. Let me find it.
How many of you guys have ever done a Bible study in Ezra before? Huh? Never. Probably. I know I never have.
Wait.
Now, in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, made a beginning together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upwards to supervise the work of the house of the Lord.
And then verse 12.
I need my better glasses. But many of the priests and the Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid. Through many shouted aloud for joy.
Okay, so we have in 582, they left. They were deported and sent to Babylon. And in 536, some of those older men that had been away for 40 years ish had come back, and they were weeping and rejoicing that the temple that they saw destroyed, the Levites, the priests, that they were continuously serving them. Couldn't believe it. They was being rebuilt by their very enemies that conquered them. Unbelievable. Sometimes that's the way that God works. The devil will take something from you, and then the people that end up restoring it to you are the very people sometimes who took from you to begin with. Very strange. But in 535 now, during that context, a year after the foundation is laid for the second temple, Daniel is said to have written his book. And so in that year, now you kind of know when you're reading Daniel, what's going on around him. So you've got Darius that we just heard about, right? We've got in Babylon, there's the return from Babylon. So when we read Daniel, we can really get an understanding that he's in this transition period back from Babylon to Jerusalem. So reading the book of Daniel now opens up way new light. And so we might probably what we'll do is another study on the book of Daniel, and then have this as a backdrop. But in 535 BC, we have Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Well, we don't know if that was the year he had it, but since Daniel's book was written, then that's when it was recorded. So it was possibly, we have to map the times of when he had the dreams in terms of who was reigning, but it was at least 536 because Darius had already, come into favor. Daniel had already come into favor with Nebuchadnezzar at that point in time. So it probably wasn't later than that. It was because he's writing about it. He's writing about things that have happened. So in 535, he's writing about something that happened within the last probably 10 years. And the vision is that we have this statue of this man with a head of gold, arms and chests of silver, bellies and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. And Nebuchadnezzar is told about no, this is not Darius, this is Nebuchadnezzar, right? So this has got to be back to if we're looking at the time frame, when does Nebuchadnezzar? Okay, so 598, right? So he could have Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know if it's Nebuchadnezzar the first or the second. So it's at least either the 650s to 605. So before all this is happening, we have it written about in 535. We got remember that when we're going toward the year zero, our years are going down, not up. So backward in time goes up in number when you're going to BC. So really you've got 60, 70 years, it looks like it's manifesting here. Now, it's all well and good to understand at that time that he's writing it, that the head of gold is Babylon and the chest of arms is silver is Medo-Persia. But in his time, when Daniel's giving this prophecy, the belly and thighs of bronze, which is Greece, and the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay, those haven't happened yet in his time. In our time, they have. We understand this retrospectively. But looking forward, if you look at his time frame, it's right about the mid-chest level, where the ram is on the left side there. You'll see the 500, 400 BC or whatever, the 535. They're sitting there between the transition between the Babylonian and the Medo-Persians. Now, the Medo-Persians and the Babylonian Empire still exist contiguously. It's not that one completely disappeared when the other one was gone. They were side by side with each other for many years, just like the Grecians were. So there's some overlap in terms of the times. But what this is talking about is as pertaining to the land of Judea, who had authority and who was the main principal power in terms of world power at that time in succession. Okay. And so the first one was being the head of gold would be Babylon. That was Nebuchadnezzar. The Medo-Persian, that's Cyrus. Greece is Alexander. And then the legs of iron are going to be the Roman Empire, which is the Eastern, Western, the Byzantine, and the Latin empires. And the feet of clay mixed with iron is the Holy Roman Church, which we talked about in the Catholic study about the clay being mixed with iron, meaning clay is the church, iron is the Roman system, and we have the Western and the Eastern, the Byzantine or the Greek Orthodox, and we have the Latin Catholic, which are very, very close and very similar, but part of the same divided sort of state-powered entity. So that is telling of the future, of the present, and of their recent past. And then in 516 BC, the second temple is actually finished under Darius the Great, 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. There's a whole Bible study that we could do that maybe I'll have Josh or Jordan teach, which is how all of the furniture and the rituals of the temple were typologically hidden. The Christ was hidden in them. Things like baptism to do with the laver of water, incense being prayer, the sacrifice of the bulls. all these things are typological of Christ. And so there's a whole Bible study called Seeing Christ in the Tabernacle, which is a really interesting thing that and provides an analysis of all of the major rituals and furnitures of the temple and how it was actually laid out like a cross, but how it actually foretells the coming of the Messiah. And the purpose of the Messiah was hidden in their very rituals. One thing you'll find interesting in the book of Luke, once you understand that, is that the angel Gabriel comes to, when John the Baptist is being annunciated, that his birth was going to come, that his father was a priest and was at the table of incense. And there's a whole study that could be done on why did the angel appear to him at the table of incense in the temple. Little things to unpack. Any questions so far, or we'll keep going? Keep going, yeah. All right. So here's a little bit of a closer look again at the temple, the different washing stations, the altar of sacrifice, the altar of incense. There's the table of showbread. There's the menorahs, or the candlesticks, the showbreads in the center. And we have the Ark of the Covenant in the center, and we have the different cherubim, and we have the different priest quarters in the storehouse there. So this is the beginning of Solomon's temple. It's about the same size as David's, the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, and it was expanded later on, which we're going to look at. But in 485, Jerusalem is again besieged and conquered by a coalition of neighboring states. So as the Medo-Persian Empire becomes more fractured, area tribes and factions start to kind of beat up on it. The temple is partly destroyed and burned, and a lot of the walls are torn down. In 450 is when Ezra writes his book, looking backward on those events. So when you just read Ezra, we just showed you the years that those things happened, but Ezra writes about them in hindsight. So he writes in 450 of the things which recently happened. And so in 445 BC, we just had read about, Mackenzie read about Artaxerxes issuing the decree to rebuild the city. So basically, they had left Jerusalem. It was conquered. It was destroyed. And 445, Artaxerxes says, okay, we're going to rebuild the walls. So from the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, this is when this clock starts, the prophetic clock starts ticking on the arrival of the Messiah. Again, just for good record, 430, First and Second Chronicles are written by Ezra. So when you're reading Ezra, those are kind of the order in which, if you want to start reading Old Testament books, read Daniel, then read Ezra, then read First and Second Chronicles in that order, and you'll get a good sense of that chronology. But as we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Alexander the Great, with the Grecian Empire, would defeat Persia, and they would gain control of Israel and Judah. And so begins the Hellenistic or Greek period of Israel and Judah. A lot of people ask, why did the Jews speak Greek? Why was the New Testament written in Greek if they all spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, which was a sort of a Persian dialect, a Semitic language that was of Persian origin? Why did they speak Greek? Because by the time from the 323 BC to 30 AD, the Greek culture was the pervasive culture, even though the conquering period of the Macedonian king, Alexander, was very short-lived. the the regions of power. Daniel predicts the breaking up of his kingdom into four kingdoms that would continuously be vying for power, but they were Hellenistic kingdoms. And so the pervasive language and commerce language that was used in that time, in that period, in that region was not Latin. It was not Italian. It was not Etruscan. It was not there was some people that spoke Aramaic, but the more common language was Greek. And so what the question is, did the disciples speak Greek or did they speak Hebrew? There's a lot of controversy on whether or not the name of Jesus is really Jesus or if it's Yeshua. And there's a big to-do in certain Christian communities that the only name is Yeshua and Jesus or Jesu isn't correct, or Jesus isn't right. Yep.
There's another time where something like this happened when England, while they were still speaking Anglo-Saxon, were invaded by the French, and the French rulers were all speaking French, and so the people speaking Anglo-Saxon had to start adapting really quick and speaking that language in order to just get by in their conquered society.
Yeah, the
And
language of
then
England was French for a long time.
yeah, and then eventually they kind of merged into modern English. So I think it's that same sort of deal where I think they're keeping their native tongue, but still speaking the language of the political system.
Well, and the other thing was in the Greek system, they were very advanced in their writing and in their philosophy and in their the tradition of writing. You had the ancient philosophers, you had the Greek mythos that were written, you had the ancient poets, things like that. You had Virgil. I'm not sure about the dating on Virgil and Ovid and all those guys and Euripides and things like that. But you have a long tradition of writing and literacy, which wasn't that common. And so the question was, would Jewish converts to Christianity, were they more likely to know Hebrew or Greek? And the question is, they probably knew Hebrew, but probably only from like Hebrew school, like Jews in America do now, and to read the Torah. But if you were going to write letters to people, or if you were going to write a general book and hope that it would be published throughout the entire region that you know, the language you would use would be Greek, and the language you probably would be speaking in would be Greek, even if you were fluent in perhaps Hebrew. So the question is, the ancient Koine Greek is likely the language they spoke. We know that Jesus could speak Aramaic, right? So he knew. We don't know if he spoke ancient Latin. We don't think that he did, but we do know that if you look up on the cross, when they put the sign up around Jesus, they put it up in three languages, didn't they? Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So I want to look it up in the background and look at what are the three languages they put it in. I think it was Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Or I don't know if it was Aramaic or not. But he spoke Aramaic on the cross, which is again a Semitic language, not classical Hebrew. So
It
even
says Hebrew, Latin, and Hellenic, which would be Greek.
yeah, or Hellenic, yeah. So Latin would be for the Romans, right? Hebrew would be for the Jews that were there, and for the ruling class of Jews, and then you'd have the Hellenic, which is the common folk, right? So we don't have scriptures in Aramaic. Why? Because he wanted the gospel written for all nations. And so they wrote in the language of power of that day. It was translated by Jerome into Latin in the first couple centuries after the New Testament was completed. And in fact, there was a Greek version of the New Testament produced early on, which was called the Septuagint. And so they were likely reading their at the time of the disciples, it was very possible that they were. I have to look at my canon period again. I have to research this and make sure I'm right, but it's very possible that the Septuagint might have been written by then. Don't quote me on it because I have to look it up. I wrote it down and I can't remember it offhand. But they might have even been reading their Old Testament or their scriptures in Greek using the Septuagint. So I'll check that at the very end of the study when I leave this here. So here we have Greek. So in the Hellenistic world, right here, this is what the new kingdom looks like in the region. The Seleucid kingdom was one of the 4 Greek kingdoms. It's in purple. And that's one of the Seleucid dynasties is who produced the Hasmonean dynasties, which are the Herods. So you'll see Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herodias, the Herods that were kings or vassal kings of the Roman state. By the time Rome comes in there, they were connected historically to the Seleucid kingdom, which is that purple kingdom. So 323 BC, Alexander the Great dies. He died very young. He was like something like 27 or something like that. And then his kingdom was divided into the 4 dynasties. And after they finally fought it out, this is sort of what things looked like at the end of all the wars. All of these wars and battles between these 4 regions and states, they were prophesied by Daniel. They went back and forth, fighting for power from the north to the south, to the east to the west, allies and antagonists. And it was to the letter. If you ever read Haley's Bible Handbook, you can go look up this period of Daniel in Haley's Bible Handbook, and Edmund Haley does an amazing job of talking about exactly how Daniel predicted these things to happen, and they happened 400 years after he predicted it. Unbelievable. 300 to 400 years, something like that. So the green area again, and there's the Ptolemaic, and then the Seleucid. So the Ptolemaic dynasty had their seat of power in what was Alexandria, and that's going to become important in later church history. But Ptolemy Soter, it took from the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was the orange there. He takes over power. I think the numbers I think it's 385 to 382, not 305. Sorry, that's a wrong number. He takes over Jerusalem, but Seleucus I, which is of the Green Kingdom, challenges that. So there's a war between them. So then in 198 BC, Ptolemy from the North African kingdom loses Jerusalem to the Seleucids under Antiochus III, the Great. Now, his son is the one we want to pay attention to, because his son Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, of the Hellenistic Greek Seleucid Empire, coming out of the Macedonians, right? He is the one who sets himself up to be a king and commits this thing called abomination of desolation. So it's not something that happens it happens between him and Emperor Vespasian. And we're going to get into the Roman side of things later, but I haven't quite gotten a chance to finish the study yet. But Antiochus, he comes in and he takes over Jerusalem. He deposes the high priest, Jason, and replaces him with a Seleucid priest named Menelaus, who offered him a big bribe to take over the office. So then when he was campaigning and fighting Ptolemy in Egypt and trying to conquer the northern African dynasty of Ptolemy, the rumor spread in Judea that Antiochus was killed. So Jason, the high priest, gathers a force of 1,000 soldiers, makes an attack on the city of Jerusalem, forcing Menelaus to flee Jerusalem during a riot. But then Antiochus comes back from battle and he's enraged. And so he attacks Jerusalem, restores them, and then he executes the Jewish rebels. And then so here's where he ends the temple sacrifice. He outlawed then the Jewish religious rites and traditions in the temple in Jerusalem, and he changed it to a Greek Jewish cult that included Zeus or Jupiter worship. The Greek historian wrote, Antiochus remember that the pigs are unclean to the Jews. So I don't know why there's an image of Moses in the temple, but apparently he sacrificed a great swine at the image of Moses and at the altar of God that stood in the outward court. So where people were giving the blood in the bulls sacrifice, he killed a pig on there. And then he sprinkled the blood of the pig all over all the temple furniture. And then also all of the other books and scriptures and scrolls, he sprinkled with broth made of swine's flesh. And he put out the lamp, the menorah, and he ordered the priests and the other Jews to eat the swine's flesh. He stopped the daily sacrifices, slaughtered pigs in the altar, put an icon of Zeus in the temple, and started having sacrifices made to Zeus in the temple. So when we talk about things about the abomination of desolation, that's not to come. That's already happened. And it's happened twice. It happened here from Antiochus, and it also happened with Vespasian. So when these things were, this is the book of Second Maccabees, which is an apocryphal book, but it is historically accurate. It's not Bible, but it's an intertestamental book. The Catholics include in their canon, but it is actually a non. It's not considered scripture. It's considered Jewish history. It says, when these things were happening, reported to the king, he thought that Judea was in revolt, raging like a wild animal. These things he's talking about that he was reported dead, right? So raging like a wild animal, they set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 people were killed, 40,000 met a violent death, and the same number were sold into slavery. You talk about an anti-God person. So what does he do? Then he sacked the city again in 168, the second time. And then he creates a military Greek citadel called the Acra to serve as a stronghold and a garrison on the Temple Mount. Mattathias leads the Maccabean revolt against the Hellenization of Jerusalem. This is what Hanukkah is all about. If you go back and read my Bible study on Hanukkah, if you just look under Hanukkah or there's an article on the River Forum called "Should Christians Celebrate Hanukkah?" It talks all about this. How the family of the Maccabees revolted against the Seleucid king Antiochus, and then they succeeded, and they established the Hasmonean dynasty. So Mattathias on the right-hand side, you've got Simon Thassi, John Hyrcanus, Salome Alexander, Hyrcanus, and it goes all the way down to Herod the Great, who was king of Judea in the year 37 to 4 BCE. So Herod the Great is the king. If you remember the story of the birth of Jesus, there was King Herod. So that's where King Herod comes from and why he's there during a Roman occupation. He becomes a vassal king because what happens is after the Hasmoneans, after the Maccabees defeat the Seleucid king Antiochus, right? They were enraged, right? They established their own kingdom, their own monarchy. They declare in 152 BC, they declare the capital of their dynasty Jerusalem. And Daniel 8:14 has something to say. It says it'll take 2,300 evenings and mornings, 2,300 days. As soon as the death of the high priest Onias dies until the rededication of the temple. So that whole thing actually was prophesied, Daniel 8:14. So by 165 BC, the temple was rededicated and restored. So Daniel was written in what, 535, right? BC. So in 535 BC, it said it was going to take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary is going to be reconsecrated. And it was in 165 BC. So 400 something years, he not only says it's going to be destroyed, he says it's going to be reconsecrated and rebuilt, and it was. So that second temple is restored and dedicated. And then Pompey the Great captures Jerusalem for Rome. But he allows Herod the Great to stay in power as a vassal king who pays tribute to Rome. And that's why you see it's a Roman province of Judea, being governed by Pilate, but under the authority of Herod, whose son Herod Antipas was the one who, when Jesus was being condemned, Pilate said, "I don't find any fault in him," and he sends him to Herod, right? And Herod says, "I don't. He's just a fool," and he sends him back to Pilate. So that whole step shows that Herod is in power at the time in Judea. Okay, but that Herod is the son of this Herod. You got Herod the Great, which is Herod the First. So Herod the First is the Hasmonean king, who is from the Seleucid dynasty. He's a Hellenistic king. He's from like an Edomite, I think is his background. He's quasi-Jewish in his beliefs, but he doesn't live like a Jew. But he's sympathetic to them because they put him in power, right? So he's not really practicing Jew, but he's part of the Hasmonean dynasty that defeated the Seleucids. But under his rule, he expands the temple and it becomes twice the size. So if you compare the Solomon's temple on the upper left to Herod's temple, that's where we hear things about the outer court of women, the different chambers, the different gates, the holiest of holies, the wall, all these other things. So that is sort of a rendition or CG rendition of, by 20 or 19 BC, we have the second temple sort of refurbished and rebuilt and rededicated and expanded in the outer courts, etc. Then we have the birth of Jesus. Any time between 4 BC and 3 AD, Jesus is born. I haven't done a lot of research into so I'm not one of those people that has it really pinned down to a certain day and I'm going to live or die on my sword by it. But in that time frame, somewhere in there, Jesus is born. Okay. And we know it's while Herod the Great was still in power because sometime between 7 BC and 2 AD, he hears about the birth of Jesus from the wise men that are the Magi who are in his kingdom that actually come to him and explain to them that the king was born. And so then he orders the massacre of the innocents, and then they're all destroyed, all the firstborn children. That's when they escape to Egypt. So Herod the Great, around 1 BC, Herod the Great dies. And then with Herod the Great dying, the region becomes more fully a Roman province of Judea or Judea. So remember, we had Israel and Judah, but now it's the Roman province of Judea, which is borrowing from the word Judah. And they use Judea and Israel now are used interchangeably for the same region. Palestine as a word for that didn't happen until the 19th century. So you've got Judea now. And his son Herod Antipas assumes control over Judea as a Roman vassal king, reigning from 4 BC to 39 AD. And he was the one that was in power. He was the one that basically had married had married wrong, the one that with John the Baptist. He killed John the Baptist. John the Baptist condemned him for his sins. He's the one that was, involved with Salome. He is the one that did not condemn Christ, and was ruling when Pilate was involved. Jesus begins his ministry in AD 30. He's crucified around 33 or 34. We have a first Jewish-Roman war, and we're going to talk about this probably another time. But basically, there's going to be, it says, from the time of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince. Now, this is written in 535 BC. So the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince should be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. There's some charts that I have in the end back that talk about these things are called weeks of years. So it's like 490 years. It's 70 times 7. And the streets shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. Remember, they were building the wall, and they didn't get it built, and they stopped and they restarted again? We read about that. That's what he's talking about, that the troublous times. After 62 weeks, which is basically 33 years, Messiah is going to be cut off. I mean, it talks about the crucifixion. And it talks about then the people of the prince that shall come. This is talking about the prince that shall come, is talking about Vespasian, the emperor Roman Vespasian. When he attacks the city in the year 70, he is not yet a Caesar. He is a prince. He is the son of a Caesar. So when he came in AD 70 to destroy the city and the sanctuary, he destroyed it completely. Remember, Jesus said that not one stone will be left on another stone? He did that. And he completely leveled it to the ground and made it completely desolate. And they killed about 1 million Jews in the process. The city and the sanctuary. So not just the temple, but the entire city of Jerusalem razed to the ground. And that happened in 70 AD. And then he shall confirm the covenant for 1 week, and he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And that he did. Vespasian caused all of the sacrifices in the temple to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, you shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. Consummation, what is the consummation? The rapture of the church. Until the rapture of the church, the temple will be desolate. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. God's wrath. Okay? So we're not to be looking for another temple to be built. Until the rapture comes, we should expect desolation to be there in terms of no offering for sin, no temple. And from the year 70 onward, there has been no temple. And there is a mosque there now, and the Jews can't even so much as lift a shovel to dig under it. So there are lots of different charts that people have that you can lose yourself in. People predict to the very solar day or whatever that this is, some of these are right, some of these are wrong. None of it really matters. What matters is the order and sequence of events, not so much the actual days and weeks and things. But I mean, you can find cases to really pinpoint it to the day, and then you can find sources that challenge that, and you can spend your whole life in this area of research and study. But what you need to get out of it is not so much the specificity of the historical days, but it's that the spans between them are accurate to the prophecies of the Bible. So like this event, from this event to this event, is a span of time, and those things are true, and those things have held up and been proven. So this person is saying that in April 33rd, year 33, the seventh Passover, the temple law is abolished, right? Or the consummation for sin or whatever. But 1290 days, uh, starting with Jesus's baptism, whatever. So there's a lot of these different sort of charts that you can get into. I don't consider them important in terms of getting into all these dates and things. It's sort of dizzying. If it interests you, fine, go after it. Everybody thinks they have new revelation every time they get into it, and the more they learn, the more they find out they're wrong. So I don't like to produce any sort of dogma or doctrine out of this. But what we can do is understand the main themes that the temple was going to be destroyed, there was going to be desolation into the end of days. And it's going to be the city is going to be trodden underfoot until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. We're in the time of the Gentiles right now. So we should not expect a third temple, is my point. And a lot of people are expecting a third temple to be built. Here's another chart that talks about the Daniel's 70 weeks from the 69 weeks from the word to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah would be 70 and 2 weeks, which is 77 weeks and 62 weeks, which is from 475, the decree of Artaxerxes, the rebuilding remaining built for 62 weeks, then the coming, and it talks about the baptism. There's things that have to do without the baptism. So there's lots of different people that are sort of mapping this out that you can get involved with and sort of study. I'm not here to prove or disprove any of them. But Jesus did prophesy about the end time in the temple during his ministry in Matthew 24. We read some of that. We talked about the seals. We talked about the rapture. We talked about the end time. And so, he came to Jerusalem, right? He was crucified in Jerusalem. He came into the temple, Mount Moriah, right? So all these places, that he's referred to, Daniel is talking about Messiah coming and being cut off. Well, we know that happened. So you can't be a Jew today and look at your Old Testament and say Messiah hasn't come. Because it talks about from the decree until Messiah, the coming of Messiah, right? What does it say? 70 weeks are appointed from your holy city to terminate the transgression and to end sin. Well, when was the termination of transgression, the ending of sin? When Jesus died on the cross. There's no more sin because he defeated sin. He defeated sacrifice. We don't need to do that. It says from the word to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So if Daniel is saying that from the order of Jerusalem, there's going to be 69 weeks, and then Messiah comes, what standing does a modern Jew or even a Muslim have today to say that Jesus, who came precisely at that time, as prophesied by Daniel, that they should be expecting some other savior coming in some yet future time frame? When Daniel said what happened, it was a measured time from the time to rebuild Jerusalem. Well, okay, if it's 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and we're talking about Jerusalem today, are we talking about from 1948 when Israel was reestablished? Are we counting from then to rebuild Jerusalem? Because it was a wasteland when they got there. The Palestinians weren't living there, and they weren't producing anything in the land. It was rubble and nothing. So you see, there's no excuse for them to say that Jesus is not our Messiah. The Messiah is manifested in the Old Testament. This is not New Testament. This is Jewish scriptures. These are the scriptures our Muslim friends and our Jewish friends all accept and believe. So why would they be looking for a new Messiah or another Messiah yet to come when Messiah has already been predicted to come and he did exactly what Daniel said he was going to do? So that is he crucified. Then we're going to get down the road. We'll get more into the Jewish war, and I don't have an ending for this yet. But basically, the Romans. Here's what happened. So Vespasian comes in. Hang on. Jesus is crucified, dies, rises, and ascends to heaven. Then there's a war against Jerusalem, called the Siege of Jerusalem by Rome. Jerusalem's destroyed. Josephus says, and I have the book of Josephus here, that the city was so thoroughly razed to the ground by those that demolished it to its foundations that nothing was left that could ever persuade visitors that had once been a place of habitation. This is a non-Christian. Remember what Jesus said about the temple, that no stone will be left standing on top of each other? That's what Josephus said about the destruction of Jerusalem. Tacitus, the Roman, said 600,000. Josephus says 1,000,000 Jews of Jerusalem either died of starvation or were killed or were sold into slavery. Jesus had warned the church to flee to the mountains in Matthew, and they did. And they went to Pella, they went north, they left Jerusalem and never went back. And that's why after 70 AD, you see all the apostles moving north and moving to North Africa. You see Mark going to Alexandria. You see Paul up in Ephesus. You see the Christians going to Antioch. You see them in Macedonia and Corinth. They got out of there. So in 132 to 135, there's another Jewish revolt that's suppressed again in 135. After that, they actually rebuild a city in the Jerusalem area called Aelia Capitolina, which was a military garrison founded on Jupiter. It says, following this revolt, Emperor Hadrian combined the Judea province with under the new name of Syria Palestina, replacing the name of Judea. That's where we get the idea for Palestine. The city was renamed Aelia Capitolina and built in the style of a Roman town. Jews were prohibited from entering the former Jerusalem on pain of death, except for 1 year on Tishba Eve, one day during the holiday of Tishba. Basically, they secularized the city completely. No Jews, no Christians. Historical sources indicate that the rebuilt city was then inhabited by veterans of the Roman military from the western parts of the empire, and the ban against the Jews was maintained until the 7th century. That's 600s. That means until the rise of Islam, Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem. So when Muhammad and the Ubaid dynasty started, Muslims started, the caliphate started invading, the Jews weren't anywhere near power. They were not a non-presence. But the Christians were granted an exception during the 4th century. So that's around the 300s, 300 to 400. Then it was taken over by Byzantium, and then it was born under Muslim control in 638 for the first time. Between 685 and 705, the Dome of the Rock was built, which is in place now. Those were built by the Muslim Caliphate, the Umayyad. I said Ubayd, I meant Umayyad dynasty, and that exists today on the Temple Mount. And that's how the whole shebang looks today. The Western Wall is one of the last pieces that was left from that utter destruction, and that's why the Jews pray there, because it's the last piece of their city that exists after the complete destruction. So there's the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is now run by, anti-Jewish, the Islamists believe that they hold that this is to do with Mount Moriah, and they hold it sacred because of Abraham, but they deny Christ, right? So they're not going to allow Jewish sacrifices to take place here because they see themselves as reformers of Judaism. So there's no way they'll ever allow that. So today, what would you have to do in Israel to build a third temple? And one,
Start a war.
yeah, you'd have to destroy the Dome of the Rock of the Al-Aqsa Temple. And then what do you think is what if the Jews started doing that, what do you think would happen in that region?
Total warfare.
War.
Total world warfare. That's right. That's right. Complete destruction. Now that's going to happen after New Jerusalem is set down there, and Jesus reigns for 1,000 years there. All the nations of the world are going to gather against it and fight it, and then he's going to destroy them. But imagine if the Jewish state started building it now. The entirety of the Muslim world would march on that. March on that. And that's where you get your Armageddon from. So even if they started, even if they wouldn't be able to so much as build a stone, unless what they're doing now is they're trying to say, oh, it doesn't need to be in those two spots. There's another spot around there, around sort of this northern area here, where it says Temple Mount, where that word is Temple Mount. They say, well, that's really where it needs to be, and they're sort of placating the idea of the fact that it wasn't where the Dome of the Rock is, which was where people historically believe that it was, but it's that over by the Temple Mount in that wooded area, that's really the area that it's supposed to be in. So the Temple Mount faithful, other groups are trying to say, well, it doesn't need to be where the Dome of Rock is. It should be over there on the right-hand side near the Temple Mount. But most historians will tell you that's bogus. That's not where it was. It was right where the Dome of the Rock is. But again, if you were to destroy the Dome of the Rock, or even just move it delicately somewhere else, and you put one stone in place for a Jewish temple to start animal sacrifices, not only the entire liberal world starts screaming about animal sacrifices, but you're going to have the entire Muslim world coming at you for desecrating a Muslim holy site. And you're going to have, a huge war going on. So for those reasons, I don't believe that it's going to happen. And if the last two witnesses are going to be anywhere, they'll be standing in front of the Western Wall and not in front of some new temple. So again, that's sort of the layout of the land there. And that's really all I have right now. I've got more to do on this, and maybe we'll do another installment, but let's just give you a sense of what, historically what has gone on there, and no claim to the land. Now, we could go forward and look even further and look at the Crusades and look who handled the land from 685 onward to see, what is the case to be made for modern day Israel, if any. But I'm really not doing that here. I'm really just trying to show you guys, when did the desolation happen, and show that it's still desolate and it's still trodden down by non-Jewish control. Even though Israel exists around it and they have autonomy, they still don't have control of that region. And I don't believe they ever will. But I think there's a lot of people in the church, which is called this new wave of Zionism, that are really supporting Israel, which I do support Israel, but for different reasons. That they're really expecting a temple to be built. They call it the third temple, or third wave of Zionism, or new wave of Zionism. And they're trying to create red heifers to sacrifice to consecrate the different temple furnishings, and they've like remade the temple furnishings, and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how far they get with their efforts, but they've been at that for about 20 years and haven't done much with it. But again, so that's Jerusalem and Israel in a nutshell, sort of from its foundation to the beginning of the Muslim era. And I guess we could do another one in the Middle Ages and the Islamic era, the Islamic period. Um, so when we think about it, we hear these things and we start reading our Bibles. I think it always gives us a good, if we have some historical context in our brain when we're reading things. So that way, some of these names that we encounter that are foreign to us, oh, okay, now I've seen Artaxerxes, and I've seen Darius, and I've seen Nebuchadnezzar. That's what that means, and that's who that was. So we can start to piece the idea together and get a sense of this narrative, because our faith is grafted into this faith, and we need to understand how it maps into it and what was leading forward. And then when we read forth about prophecies of Messiah to come, to see really how spectacular this Bible is, predicting things 400, 500,000 years into the future that by people that would never see that time frame with their own eyes. Unbelievable extent to which the prophecies have come true. And they aren't like weird prophecies, like never ending story kind of stuff. It's like specific, like when you have a prophecy, Jeremiah or whatever, or Isaiah saying Cyrus the Syrian will come in, will do X, Y, and Z. And you're able to show him a 200-year-old scroll that says, "Here, Cyrus, you're mentioned." Holy cow, that's pretty scary. When Nebuchadnezzar sees the writing on the wall that happens, and then he loses his mind, right? Remember, he was turned into like a beast, and he had a full psychotic break and began eating the grass in the field like a beast because he was resisting God. So God was even working in those kingdoms there to get to the favor of Darius, down with Daniel and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of things that happen when you read those stories. You see what's going on there because all of those things were positioning the entire region and world for the coming of the Messiah. And everything had to be in place just so when he came to facilitate everything that he would need to do. So again, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? The statue, all those at that time they didn't know those further kingdoms, the Greeks, the Roman, and then the split of the Roman kingdom. So Daniel didn't have that visibility into that because those weren't the kings of his day. Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar, that's all they saw, and the Assyrians, that's all they saw. So they didn't see Alexander. He was to come. So amazing stuff, these Bibles. So we talked about end time prophecy. The trick is now, and the reason I show you that this stuff has already been happened and been fulfilled, is you got to know when you're reading about prophecy, which things pertain to our future and which things pertain to their future, but our past. Because it gets dangerous when Christians today take something that happened in our past that we're ignorant of because of a lack of knowledge of history. And we say, "Oh, I don't understand what that was, so it must be for our future," and start creating all sorts of doctrines and time frames and charts and things like that have to do to reinterpret it for another period that it wasn't meant for. Remember when he told his disciples that you will see not that in their lifetime the temple will be destroyed. Not our lifetime, their lifetime. This generation will not pass away till these things be fulfilled. And it didn't pass away. The generation of Christ saw the destruction of Jerusalem. Period. So it's not cryptic language. He actually meant what he said when he said it. He wasn't speaking in parables when he said those things. He was being very clear. He was saying, there's none of these buildings are going to be standing. The whole generation, this generation is going to see it happen, and it's not going to happen before this generation is gone and dead and gone. And it happened exactly that way. So that wasn't prophecy. It's prophecy, but it's also not allegorical, is my point. He's actually saying true, specific things that are going to happen without allegory.
He's not
That's
speaking like
powerful
Gandalf.
stuff. What's that?
He ain't speaking like Gandalf.
Go ahead.
He's not speaking like Gandalf.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like what Oregon says, you always, the one thing that hasn't changed about you, you still speak in riddles. So that's Jerusalem for tonight. Um, there's a lot to teach on Jerusalem about, how, they killed the prophets and they would not follow God, and how they turn off and on from God away to other gods. And we're not really going to deal with all of that, but just so we know that we shouldn't be really putting our energy into supporting the building of a temple in Jerusalem. Christians shouldn't want people to sacrifice animals for their sins anyway, right? Why would we be wanting a temple like that to be made when Jesus is the full propitiation for sins? That's winding us backward 2,500 years. So there's no reason a Christian should be supporting the creation of a temple that's meant to sacrifice animals for sin. But what we can do is we do know that in the end time that God is going to seal 144,000 people to use them to repopulate the holy city. And so we can be praying for those that are going to be saved from the tribulation that are Jewish, that will come to accept the Messiah, that will be sealed by him, 12,000 from each tribe. We can be supporting that. So that's why we just have to be careful where we put our energy and focus in our doctrine and our time of teaching. So that's anyway, that is Jerusalem and Israel. Any questions, comments, concerns?